The model on this page is the neurovascular head, and it's showing a structure called the Circle of Willis. Now, it's a very complicated structure, and to actually understand where all these blood vessels are coming from and going to, we have to go back and look at the thoracic cavity to see where they're originating. So this model is that of the thoracic cavity. We have the arch of the aorta right there. We have the left subclavian there. We have the brachiocephalic. We have the right subclavian, and we have the left and right common carotid arteries. Now, the subclavian arteries are going to have these structures called vertebral arteries coming off. Now, the common carotid is going to split into this blood vessel, which is the external carotid, and this blood vessel, which is the internal carotid. And the internal carotid artery is going to sneak through the carotid canal about right there. So there it's going up into the carotid canal. Now, the vertebral artery is going through these transverse foramen of the cervical vertebrae. So it's not nerves that go through there, it's a blood vessel. And it goes through the transverse foramen, and then it's going to go through the foramen magnum. So we have two large blood vessels going to supply the brain. We have the internal carotid artery that's going to go up into the carotid canal, and then we have the vertebral artery that is going to go into the brain through the foramen magnum. And that brings us to this model. So this model is the Circle of Willis, which is a perfusion system. You have the vertebral arteries, and you have the internal carotid arteries coming in, and they actually join up together, forming a loop. So if one vessel, in theory, gets clogged, there's still perfusion to the rest of the system. So the vertebral arteries are right here, and they're going to merge to form this artery. And this artery is called the basilar artery. Here is the internal carotid artery. And what's going to happen is the basilar artery has these two limbs that come off of it, and those are called the posterior communicating artery. So this limb and this limb are the posterior communicating artery. And they actually go around and hook up with the internal carotid artery. So the posterior communicating artery is right here, and it actually links with the internal carotid artery. So we have the vertebral arteries coming in, basilar artery, posterior communicating artery, and those hook up with the internal carotid. Now, off the internal carotid, we have this artery, which is the anterior cerebral artery. So this would be the anterior cerebral artery. And this little junction between the two is the anterior communicating artery. So blood could, in theory, go up through the vertebral arteries, through the posterior communicating arteries, to the anterior cerebral arteries, to the anterior communicating arteries. And because we have anterior cerebral arteries, implies we have a posterior cerebral artery and a middle cerebral artery. So play with this, rotate it around, see the different views of the Circle of Willis. So here's the anterior view. So again, the anterior cerebral arteries, the anterior communicating arteries. The posterior communicating arteries are back here. This is the posterior cerebral artery. And that is the Circle of Willis. So go through this skull, rotate it, try to find all of those structures. So here's another view of it. Here is the vertebral arteries coming up, and we have the basilar artery right at the pons right here. We then are going to have the posterior communicating artery right there. That's going to the internal carotid, which is not really on this model. This is going to the anterior. Here's the anterior communicating artery, anterior cerebral artery, middle cerebral artery, posterior cerebral artery, and we have a little bonus on this one. That's actually the cerebellar artery, which is going to go to the cerebellum. So look at the model, then go to this page, look at the different pictures of the Circle of Willis. This is another model showing where all the arteries are. And it's very tricky, so take your time on it. And your mission after this is to do an art project creating the Circle of Willis.